I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles had entered the private library expecting a routine legal briefing. Instead, a senior solicitor placed a sealed document before him and delivered a sentence that changed the emotional balance of the monarchy. Princess Charlotte, not the king, not Camilla, and not even William had been legally confirmed as the sole future beneficiary of Queen Elizabeth's most private family trust. Charles did not argue. He simply lowered his eyes, gripped the edge of the table, and stopped speaking. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had been summoned to a closed meeting at Windsor Castle, where 2 trust lawyers, the keeper of the privy purse, and a palace archivist were already waiting. The keeper of the privy purse was the senior official responsible for managing the sovereign's private finances. The king had expected routine estate administration. Instead, the absence of Camilla and William told him that the matter had been deliberately separated from the wider family. The lawyers confirmed the central fact without softening it. Elizabeth's private trust named Charlotte as its sole eventual beneficiary. A private trust was a legal structure used to protect money, property, and personal assets for a chosen heir. Inside it were investments, family heirlooms, unpublished correspondence, historic possessions, and a financial reserve that no reigning monarch could redirect. Charles read the first page twice. He removed his glasses and placed them carefully beside the file. His devastation did not come from Charlotte receiving the inheritance. He loved his granddaughter. The pain came from realizing that his mother had deliberately placed the entire legacy beyond his control. When one solicitor asked whether he wished to pause, the king answered only, "Continue." The next clauses deepened the wound. Charles could not dissolve, amend, borrow against, or influence the trust. William could act only as temporary guardian until Charlotte reached the age fixed by Elizabeth. Even the future king had been given responsibility without ownership. Then the archivist presented the handwritten directive. Elizabeth had ordered the inheritance protected from marital pressure, changing courts, and temporary loyalties. Charles recognized the phrasing immediately. It was not vague legal language. It was a personal warning, shaped by decades of family conflict, shifting influence, and private distrust. The final revelation came quietly. One senior royal had known about the arrangement before Elizabeth's death, and had been waiting for this meeting to occur. As Charles stared at his mother's handwriting, another truth became impossible to ignore. The trust had not merely enriched Charlotte, it had placed every adult around her under judgment. Princess Charlotte was not sitting in a legal chamber when her future changed. She was completing an ordinary lesson when William received the call that would place his daughter at the center of a conflict she was still too young to understand. The prince listened without interrupting, thanked the solicitor, and looked toward the closed schoolroom door. For one long moment, he was not the future king. He was a father deciding how much truth a child should hear. Charlotte's position had always carried unusual weight. She was not only William's daughter, but a young royal whose calmness and growing sense of duty had repeatedly reminded Elizabeth of the strongest women in the family. Her place in the line of succession, the official order determining who may inherit the crown, gave the private trust a powerful public meaning. Yet the girl herself remained unaware that adults were already arguing over what her name represented. William viewed the inheritance as a responsibility to protect. Charles saw it as a final message from his mother. Camilla heard something more threatening in Elizabeth's restrictions, a warning about the household she now helped shape. Catherine found her husband standing alone with the legal summary folded in his hand. He told her that Charlotte had inherited something far heavier than money. The princess reminded him that their daughter must never feel responsible for wounds created before she was born. Charles carried a different sadness. The king asked an aide to bring him a recent photograph of Charlotte. Holding it, he said he was proud of his granddaughter. But his expression tightened as he admitted that Elizabeth had designed the trust as though she expected resistance from him. Pride and rejection existed together, and neither softened the other. Camilla received only a brief verbal account. She noticed immediately that Charles avoided showing her the handwritten instruction. When the Queen Consort asked whether the trust affected royal property under her use, he answered too quickly that it did not. His haste deepened her suspicion. Then the lawyers disclosed that Charlotte was more than a beneficiary. Elizabeth had named her future custodian of a private historical archive, meaning she would eventually control access to protected family letters and decide whether some were ever released. The inheritance carried memory, silence, and authority, not merely wealth. William then learned who had known. Princess Anne had understood the trust's broad purpose and personally witnessed one of Elizabeth's final instructions. Charles would now have to face his sister and ask why she had guarded the secret. To understand why Elizabeth chose Charlotte, and why Anne had guarded the secret, the family would have to return to one decisive evening when the late Queen's trust in her own court finally broke. The trust had not been created because of a passing affection or an impulsive grandmother's wish. Its final form was triggered by one specific confrontation at Windsor, months before Queen Elizabeth's death. That evening, a private family discussion about heirlooms, residences, and future influence became unexpectedly heated. When the late monarch heard one request concerning Charlotte's future inheritance, she ended the conversation, asked everyone to leave, and summoned her solicitor before midnight. By morning, the monarchy's private legacy had been rewritten. Elizabeth had first established the trust years earlier to protect possessions belonging to the Windsor family rather than the crown itself. A private family trust was a legal structure used to safeguard personal assets outside the property formerly controlled by the monarchy. Several descendants were originally expected to benefit, while the reigning sovereign retained limited influence over how the assets were managed. Over time, however, the Queen became disturbed by arguments surrounding residences, jewels, patronages, and access to private history. Anne saw the change clearly. She watched conversations once shaped by service become battles over control. The princess later described that concern in a documented account preserved with the trust papers, noting that her mother had begun to fear the family was treating inheritance as leverage rather than responsibility. The breaking point came during a private dinner at Windsor. Camilla proposed that future inheritances, intended for William's children, should first pass through a central household committee overseen by Charles. She argued that such a system would maintain consistency and prevent confusion. Elizabeth heard something else. To her, the proposal placed Charlotte's legacy under adult political control before the girl could even understand what was being protected for her. The Queen set down her spoon and looked directly at Charles. She asked whether he supported the plan. He hesitated. He did not reject it. Elizabeth answered quietly, "Then I have my answer." The calmness of those words carried more force than anger. Anne followed her mother after the room emptied and found her gripping the back of a chair. She asked whether Elizabeth felt unwell. The monarch replied that she was simply tired of watching affection become negotiation. Before midnight, Elizabeth summoned her private solicitor to Windsor. She dictated changes removing the reigning sovereign's amendment powers and placing Charlotte beyond future interference. Anne witnessed the first instruction and promised to protect it, even from Charles. The revised trust contained one final danger. Any direct challenge to Charlotte's position would activate additional restrictions. The hidden history transformed Charles's pain into something sharper, because the next person entering his room would not be a lawyer or an aide. It would be Anne, carrying the memory of the night his mother lost faith in him. When Princess Anne entered the king's sitting room, Charles dismissed every aide and closed the door himself. No officials remained to soften the language. No solicitor stood between them. On the table lay Elizabeth's directive, open to the sentence about temporary loyalties. Charles asked his sister one question. "Did you know she meant me?" Anne did not immediately answer. She pulled out a chair, sat opposite him, and prepared to tell the truth he feared most. Charles accused Anne of allowing him to remain publicly sovereign while privately excluded from their mother's most meaningful plans. A sovereign was the reigning monarch, the person who formally stood at the head of the crown. He said that as Elizabeth's son, he deserved warning before lawyers presented the trust as fixed and irreversible. The king was not demanding control in that moment. He was demanding recognition as a child who believed he had been judged without being allowed to defend himself. Anne answered without retreat. She explained that she had not designed the trust and would receive nothing from it. Her role had been limited but serious. She witnessed Elizabeth's mental capacity, preserved the documents, and ensured the instructions reached the solicitors without interference. The princess had promised their mother silence, and she had kept it. Charles pushed the file across the table and asked why Elizabeth could trust a child more than her own king. Anne pushed it back. She said the late monarch trusted Charlotte precisely because the girl had not yet learned to turn family affection into a struggle for influence. The answer shattered his restraint. Charles rose and moved toward the fireplace, saying Anne had always enjoyed the privilege of honesty with their mother, while he had carried the burden of becoming her replacement. His anger weakened into grief. The directive felt like a final rejection from someone he could no longer confront, question, or forgive. Anne then named the event that had caused the amendment. Camilla's proposed committee at the Windsor dinner convinced Elizabeth that Charlotte's inheritance could become vulnerable to pressure from the adult court. She accused no one of theft or conspiracy. She simply stated what the Queen had believed. Then came the cruelest revelation. Elizabeth's documented notes showed that she waited 48 hours for Charles to reject the proposal. He never did. His silence became the answer she acted upon. A knock interrupted them. An aide announced that Camilla was waiting outside and insisting on speaking with both siblings. Charles had just learned that his silence cost him his mother's confidence. Now he would have to explain why the woman beside him had become the reason Elizabeth placed Charlotte beyond their reach. Camilla entered expecting a family argument she could contain. Instead, she found Anne beside the king and 3 lawyers returning with a second file. One solicitor remained standing as he explained that the matter was no longer governed by royal preference. Elizabeth had built the trust under private law, appointed independent trustees, and removed every mechanism through which the crown might interfere. Charles could command the palace, but inside this room, his mother's signature carried greater power than his throne. 3 independent trustees now controlled the arrangement: a senior solicitor, a private financial administrator, and a family representative named in Elizabeth's instructions. A trustee was a person legally required to protect property for someone else, rather than use it for personal benefit. William remained Charlotte's parental guardian, but he could not withdraw money, redirect heirlooms, or place any part of the inheritance into palace service. The lawyers then explained why rank could not change the result. Elizabeth had placed private possessions inside the trust, not crown estate assets or objects held by the sovereign for official use. The crown estate was the large collection of property managed for the monarchy in its public role. Because these assets belonged to her personally, Charles's constitutional position gave him no automatic control. Camilla defended the Windsor proposal. She insisted that the committee had been designed to protect the children from competing advisors, not seize Charlotte's inheritance. Anne answered that the explanation no longer mattered. Elizabeth had judged the structure itself and decided it created too much opportunity for pressure. Charles asked his sister to soften her tone, then turned immediately toward Camilla. He wanted to know why she had never told him how strongly his mother reacted. The queen consort's expression tightened. She said she believed the matter had ended when the dinner ended. The king understood then that both of them had mistaken silence for resolution. The lead solicitor opened the second file and revealed the anti-challenge clause. Any attempt by a senior royal to dispute Charlotte's beneficiary status would automatically move several discretionary family assets into a separate locked foundation. A foundation was a legally protected body created to preserve property for a fixed purpose. A court battle would therefore reduce family access instead of restoring it. The final clause carried even greater weight. When Charlotte reached the specified age, she would control not only wealth, but also the preservation, study, and possible publication of Elizabeth's personal archive. She would become guardian of the late Queen's human story. The trustees now required William's signature. The power had now shifted away from the king and toward the future king, But William's decision would determine whether Charlotte inherited a protected legacy or the burden of a family rupture carried out in her name. William read the acknowledgement twice before touching the pen. Across from him, the solicitor explained that his signature would not give him control. It would confirm that he accepted the limits placed upon him. Catherine sat nearby, watching his expression harden. When the lawyer asked whether he wished to seek independent advice, the prince looked toward the family photograph on his desk and answered, "My daughter will not become the battlefield for somebody else's disappointment." William had received a complete inventory of the trust and a parental undertaking requiring him to protect Charlotte from pressure, publicity, and early exposure to sensitive family material. A parental undertaking was a formal promise placing clear legal responsibilities upon a guardian. The documents offered him no private advantage. They demanded restraint, discretion, and the courage to place his daughter's welfare above every argument surrounding Elizabeth's legacy. The palace machinery began changing almost immediately. Staff separated all trust records from the king's household files. Archive requests, insurance papers, invitations, and financial correspondence linked to the inheritance would now travel directly to the independent trustees. Charles could no longer rely on ordinary palace access, and William could not quietly bend the rules for him. The arrangement had moved beyond emotion and entered daily practice. William signed the acknowledgement and placed the pen beside the folder. He told the solicitor that no challenge would come from his household. His voice stayed calm, but Catherine noticed his hand tremble before he closed the file. She understood that he was protecting Charlotte while accepting that his decision would deepen the distance between him and Charles. The king called soon afterward. He asked why his son had signed without meeting him first. William replied that accepting Elizabeth's conditions was not an action against his father. It was a refusal to place Charlotte inside a dispute created by adults. Charles heard the distinction, but it did not remove the pain of being bypassed by his own heir. Camilla felt the restrictions next. Broad archive permissions previously available to the royal household were withdrawn. Any request involving Elizabeth's private correspondence now required written justification and independent approval. The queen consort could still ask, but she could no longer assume access. Then a small historical jewel was removed from palace custody. Charles watched the case leave the secure room and understood that the trust was no longer an abstract legal wound. It was changing who controlled real objects inside his home. The king chose not to challenge it. Instead, he asked William to meet him alone at Windsor. With the papers signed and the first heirloom removed, the conflict could no longer be reversed by procedure. Only a father and son, speaking without the protection of rank, could decide what remained of their trust in one another. There were no red boxes, briefing notes, or advisors when William entered the king's private room that evening. Charles had removed his jacket and placed Elizabeth's handwritten directive on the table between two untouched cups of tea. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then the king admitted that his devastation was not truly about money, property, or authority. It was about discovering that his mother had prepared for a future in which she believed his judgment might fail the family. Charles made it clear that he had not invited William to renegotiate the trust. A red box was the secure case used to carry official government papers to the monarch. But none of that formal machinery belonged in this conversation. The king wanted to know why his son had accepted the restrictions so quickly, and whether that decision reflected a wider loss of confidence in his leadership. William answered with care. Elizabeth's instructions were painful, but they were also unambiguous. As Charlotte's father, the prince's first duty was to ensure that her inheritance never became leverage in arguments involving Charles, Camilla, the court, or even his own future household. Protecting his daughter meant accepting limits upon himself as well as everyone else. The admission forced Charles toward the regret he had avoided. He confessed that he should have rejected the committee proposal after the Windsor dinner. The monarch had hoped the tension would fade if he refused to confront it directly. Instead, his silence looked like approval to Elizabeth, and she acted before he found the courage to answer. William did not use that confession as a weapon. He told his father that one failure could not erase a lifetime, but resisting its consequences would deepen the wound. Charlotte still loved Charles as her grandfather. She knew nothing of the humiliation, legal arguments, and private bitterness surrounding her name. The prince warned that the adults had to keep it that way. Charles then disclosed that advisors had prepared a public statement affirming his confidence in the management of private royal assets. William immediately saw the danger. Even coded language could make Charlotte appear victorious in a battle she had never entered. The king reached for the draft, tore it in half, and placed the pieces beside Elizabeth's letter. There would be no challenge, no public correction, and no pressure upon the trustees. Then Charles asked William to bring Charlotte to Windsor for a private afternoon with her grandfather. Charles could not rewrite his mother's final judgment, but by refusing to fight Charlotte's inheritance, he began transforming a legal defeat into the first honest act of healing the trust had produced. By sunrise, the private decision had become a national story. A major newspaper filled its front page with a formal portrait of Princess Charlotte, beneath the headline, "The Queen's Final Guardian." Broadcasters described the trust as Elizabeth's most revealing act of generational faith. Outside Windsor Castle, a crowd formed beside the gates, where one young girl placed a handwritten card among the flowers. It read simply, "Take care of her memories." That small message changed the tone of the day. Coverage spread quickly, because Charlotte had inherited more than wealth. She had been named the future custodian of Elizabeth's private archive, meaning she would one day help protect personal letters, family records, and unpublished memories preserved outside normal palace control. Commentators debated whether the choice reflected grandmotherly affection, careful planning, or a final warning about the way adult royals fought over access and influence. Palace officials issued only a restrained confirmation. They said private testamentary arrangements would be respected, using the formal term for instructions governing property after death. No figures were released, no restrictions were explained, no family dispute was acknowledged. The silence reflected Charles's decision not to challenge the trust or turn Charlotte into the public face of his disappointment. Charles watched the coverage with one aide nearby. When a broadcaster called the arrangement Elizabeth's vote of confidence in the next generation, the king's expression tightened. He could have demanded a correction or authorized a private response. Instead, he switched off the television and asked whether his granddaughter had arrived safely. His question revealed that the father and grandfather inside him had finally begun to overpower the wounded sovereign. Charlotte noticed the crowd as William's car approached Windsor. She saw the flowers, cards, and people gathered near the gates, then asked why they had come. The prince told her they were remembering her great-grandmother. She looked through the window and quietly said she hoped they were not sad. William assured her that remembrance could carry gratitude, as well as grief. Cameras continued returning to the handwritten card. Its simple message shifted the public conversation away from who had lost authority and toward what Charlotte had been asked to preserve. Two senior courtiers offered to explain Charles's side privately to sympathetic journalists. The king refused. He said no child should discover years later that her grandfather had tried to diminish a gift she never requested. The world saw an heiress, a symbol, and a future guardian of royal memory. Charles saw only his granddaughter approaching, giving him one final chance to decide what kind of legacy he would leave beside Elizabeth's. Charlotte entered expecting tea with her grandfather, not a conversation about inheritance. Charles did not show her the legal files or explain the arguments that had shaken the palace. He opened a small box containing one of Elizabeth's handwritten birthday notes and told her that her great-grandmother had trusted her to care for certain family memories when she was older. Charlotte studied the note, then asked the question no lawyer had considered. "Will you help me look after them?" The king's answer ended the conflict. Charles told her that nothing was expected of her now, except to learn, grow, and remember that family history concerned people rather than possessions. A private trust was a legal arrangement protecting property and records for a chosen person until fixed conditions were met. The king refused to describe it as a prize, a victory, or proof that she stood above anyone. He wanted Charlotte to understand that responsibility carried weight, not triumph. William remained nearby but allowed his father to lead. The prince watched Charles speak without bitterness and realized the monarch had made a decisive choice. His grief would not be passed down to the child whose inheritance had caused it. Charlotte listened carefully, still holding Elizabeth's note, then repeated her request. She wanted her grandfather's help. Charles took her hand and promised that he would stand beside her when the time came. He would help her understand the stories, but he would not control them, change them, or ask her to choose between people she loved. Charlotte accepted the promise with the simple trust of a granddaughter, unaware that her question had offered him a path out of resentment. After she left to join Catherine, Charles signed a formal letter to the independent trustees. Trustees were the people legally required to protect the inheritance for Charlotte, rather than use it for themselves. The king confirmed his full acceptance of Elizabeth's intentions and promised the cooperation of his household. Charles then explained the decision privately to Camilla. The queen consort remained wounded by the trust's restrictive language, but she agreed not to seek special archive access or revive the committee proposal. Her decision closed the immediate source of conflict. William would remain Charlotte's guardian. Anne would retain no controlling authority, and the trustees would continue safeguarding everything until the appointed age. No challenge would be filed. The protective clause would never be triggered. Queen Elizabeth's private trust ultimately became more than an inheritance. It was a final test of whether the monarchy could place a child's future above adult pride, and when Charles chose love over control, the family finally passed it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.